Always weird. Don't mind me. Just let me know when I've got 5 minutes left. I don't think I'm going to go over, but just in case. Cool. Okay, right. So let's kick off. Right. So over the last couple of years, I think we've really just seen a mass wave of protests across the world, but also I think quite specifically in Latin America. With the current Colombian protests going on over there, and there's strikes going on, like it's been going on for 3 months now. And the Colombian state keeps pushing back, but the people keep pushing forward. And there's really been just this real general feeling of unrest in Latin America that I think it's been bubbling for many, many, many years. And, there's been protests in Chile over rights to clean water, and like protests against far right governments in Brazil, multiple movements from indigenous people, trying to stop, there's like this whole thing of now the US wants to buy up loads of land there to grow like marijuana. And obviously it's like, because of the whole drugs war, it's a bit of a piss take to want to just take their land and to do that. And obviously the rainforest disappearing. So it's no surprise, I think, that Cuba has quickly followed suit in joining the wave of resistance across Latin America, because Cuba itself has a very strong history of resistance. And I think additionally, after the year we've just had, there's a real growing anger towards the governments of the world. People no longer trust in their governments the way they did prior to the pandemic. The governments, I think, really showed their true motivations during 2020, focusing on saving the economy rather than lives. And this illusion that governments are, all knowing, all powerful, and then, they've qualified for their jobs and all that kind of stuff was really dismantled, because the general public kind of took matters into their own hands to keep themselves safe. And particularly in Britain, we had that whole wartime spirit thing. So it's like, how much did they really do? And I think this, in combination with the Black Lives Matter movement that surged onto the scene last summer, was really highlighting so many gross inequalities in our society. And it's like this massive culture war between the ruling classes and anti-racists. And more people, I think, are coming around to the idea of being anti-racist. We're not quite there with them being anti-capitalist yet, but we're getting there. And, with these protests escalating across the world, they happen Black Lives Matter was global. Cuba has joined in to try and fight back against the status quo, and they're aware of these inequalities that exist, and they've got that confidence to fight back. So with all of that in mind, I'm just going to give some background to sort of the history of Cuba and its relationship to colonialism and capitalism, because I think it's quite hard to understand, not hard, but it's just it's complex, Cuba. And I think to understand why it is the way it is, we have to really first acknowledge the real deep-rooted exploitation and oppression that the ancestors of Cuban people have experienced. And I'm not going to go into much depth about loads of different things. I'm just going to kind of give an overall perspective, because I've got to leave something for the discussion. So in the beginning, Cuba was one of the first places in the Americas to be colonized. Christopher Columbus himself landed and claimed the lands for Spain, and he rapidly enslaved the native Taino people, who were very peaceful, and they would actually only fight with wooden weapons because they didn't want to actually kill their enemies. So there was a real beginning, unrest from the beginning in Cuba, because, the enslavement of native people was an action that really was a massive signifier to the rest of the colonist powers, because it was the island, Cuba and its surrounding islands was one of the first places to really sort of, instead of just killing these indigenous people and wiping them out, they would actually enslave them and get them to do work and stuff. And that, I think, echoes throughout time, and it has really changed the landscape of American society forever. And this process of massive dehumanization began towards the indigenous people. They were not just seen as uncivilized animals, but machines that would be put to work. And, this is an incredibly convenient narrative for the emerging capitalist powers. Capitalism as a system forces us to sell our labor to meet to those who own the means of production, and view the average human as a tool or a machine that can be made to work in order to survive. We're all dehumanized under capitalism, but I don't think anyone else was more dehumanized by capitalism than, the slaves. And back in the day, at the beginning, Cuba was very much described by many as this key to the new world, because of its unique geological position being between, the US, Latin America, and access to the Panama Canal. Cuba became a real central hub for trading between all the various colonies going around. And it was really becoming a really essential piece to the Western colonist projects. Despite it only really being quite a small island, its massive abundance of natural resources, such as iron, nickel, copper, and mahogany, quickly made Cuba one of the biggest exporters of goods to the colonies, and it became one of the main providers of sugarcane and natural alloys to the colonized world. And, the majority of these goods were traded with America, which is rather unusual, I think, at the beginning of the times of the colonies, because traditionally, like, the exports would all be sent back to Europe or back to Africa to be traded for slaves. But the fact that Cuba was trading within the colonies, I think, starkly just sets up the role of Cuba within the American empire for generations to come. So, Britain in particular was very keen to expand their empire, as usual, and really viewed Cuba as a key piece to doing that. And it really became an important piece for the British to try and take Cuba for their own, and sort of liberate it, as they would describe it, from the Spanish. So as it was such a key piece, Cuba, in the transatlantic move, like slave trade and everything, and the American trade routes, it was one of the last Latin American countries to be liberated from Spanish rule. And I think the grip slightly began to slip, and sort of this moment, like, abolitionist movement in Cuba really starts this real tradition that Cuba has of, like, resistance and, fighting back. But, it wasn't like a great movement like many abolitionist movements at the time. It was kind of more from business owners and, like, people who own factories, and they wanted to just, chill out. Like, they didn't want, sorry, I've lost my place. So the legal abolition of slavery was most likely as a result of pressure put on the Spanish during the 10 Years' War, which went on from 1868 to 1878. So the 10 Years' War was like this battle for economic independence in Cuba, and wealthy business owners and working class Cubans, they were growing more and more frustrated at the Spanish state, and they sort of kind of low-key banded together to get rid of its hold over the infrastructure of the country. And then there was loads of revolts, and there was this revolutionary committee that was set up, and it was created by rich plantation owners, which I think just says a lot about what type of revolutionary movement that was, because how revolutionary can it be if it's set up by plantation owners? And, the fact that it was called the 10 Years' War, I think really says something about the persistence of Cuban people in their fight for liberation, even if it wasn't entirely like a working class movement. So eventually the Spanish decided to concede, and they came up with this pact. And the pact basically promised that Cuba would be permitted representation in the Spanish parliament, amnesty for all political offences, and freedom from prison, manumission for slaves who fought on both sides, and greater freedoms for press and assembly. And while this pact kind of seems like a win for the rebels at the time, if you look at it quite closely and you look at it in sort of the grand scheme of things, it didn't actually make much of a difference. It didn't radically transform Cuban society. There was no mention of independence from Spanish rule, which infers very quickly these are just lip services. The Spanish have no intent of relinquishing control over it. So, the reform of allowing representation in parliament didn't really have an impact, because Spanish nobility were often chosen, or rich businessmen who typically held very conservative views. So they had no desire to make great change, which is kind of, I think, quite similar to what sort of happens now a little bit with the people that get elected. And, amnesty was granted to political offenders and all of that, but they would have to leave Cuba immediately. And it's just kind of like creating this really hostile environment, like, from the state, even though I guess it was almost like a form of liberation for Cuba still. And then, so, like, all of these, I think, are very similar to kind of what Cuba experiences today, but instead of the Spanish state dictating terms, it's very much the USA manipulating Cuba from afar and sometimes interfering to kind of keep that hold on it, and that, because it is so central in everything, and that's why they kind of shit themselves when the Russia came and, like, tried to take it over, or whatever they say. So the history of Cuban uprisings are really some of the most iconic throughout the world. A lot of people will know Che Guevara, or at least know the imagery of the Cuban Revolution. So an interesting question is, I guess, why are they not liberated yet? Why are they still living under a regime, and why are they still, connected to imperialism? And that's purely just because of the US and its interference within that. And people can flesh that a bit out in the discussion if they want to. But I believe that there is also probably another reason as to why Cuba is in the current state it's in. And I think this is sort of the idea of leaders is a very, very common theme throughout all the Cuban fightbacks, and especially in the Cuban Revolution. And I think this is something that has really held the movement back from reaching its full radical potential. To be involved in any revolt against the ruling class, you need to gain the support of the workers, as it's their labor power that propels society forward. So the problem with identifying so-called leaders in a revolutionary situation is itself like that, just that word leaders automatically takes autonomy away from the whole class itself and diminishes their ability to engage in the revolutionary struggle. And, you know, there's always strength in numbers, and the working class together will always be stronger, united rather than apart. And, you know, by doing this, identifying these leaders, they then become able to dictate the plans for resistance. And quite often these leaders become far too wrapped up in their individual goals and demands. And, you know, I think that's quite similar to what we see with the parliamentary politics in the UK. Like we saw something similar with Corbyn. You know, at the beginning, he was quite radical and, you know, all for it. And then I guess kind of towards the end, he'd lost that sort of spirit and had become a bit more focused on winning the election. And so many people were disenfranchised with left-wing politics after he lost the second election. And that, you know, is echoing, like, we've got that similarity of Cuba. Like, you can't identify leaders. We all have the power to change society, and we all should be exercising that power. And in Cuba, a lot of the positions of power tend to be held by what I guess we would call a sort of middle class, largely military men or business owners. They tended to call them shots. And I guess if you've got guns, you're going to be able to be the leader of a movement. And I think this is a huge part of the reasons why Cuban revolts are unsuccessful in radically changing life for Cuban citizens, because there is a real lack of a strong, united working class. And that's what you need. Like, mass protests are the way that you get change. I think the last year has proved that. You know, Black Lives Matter, what Black Lives Matter did last year for anti-racism is like propelled it forward onto the scene. And even like LGBT stuff is like, you know, there's a real shift in our society and our culture purely just from people banding together. How am I doing for time? I'm good. 5 minutes. Okay, cool. So we've seen a lot of reforms happen throughout Cuba. You know, people quite often reference they have a good education system and they have a good healthcare system. And I think, you know, the Cuban Revolution, it brought in these social reforms like voting rights, democratic organization of government, opportunity to possess private property. And, you know, this, I guess, in the context of Cuba, and if you think about its history and you think about like how ransacked it was by, you know, colonization and what a key piece it has always been in that, these are quite radical reforms and quite an improvement for the life of people in Cuba. But I think we have to be kind of like quite clear that these are not, for one, they're not socialist reforms. For people who like ask if Cuba's socialist, they're not, because the very existence of private property contradicts socialist ideals. And, you know, the threat of US interference is always looming over Cuba, and they can't do anything too radical. Otherwise they'll be blockaded again, and like the US will come and interfere with their army, stage a coup or whatever. So, you know, the links between Cuba and the US go as far back as like the 1800s. And this is kind of, the US really helped Cuba in its independence from Spain. And I don't think the US has ever kind of let that go. And because they had such a heavy hand in that, they've always been able to maintain this grip and this control over Cuba. And I don't think that has really shifted all that much under the new governments that they have, because a lot of the trade deals that are set up have resulted in a lot of business owners and gangsters making a lot of profit rather than ordinary working class people. So this growing anger and frustration at the government has been boiling over for years and years and years, and only to erupt on the 11th of July this year, which is weird because I decided to do a meeting on Is Cuba Socialist like a week before, and then these protests happened, and I didn't know that was going to happen. It's like I just felt it in my bones. So the protests in Cuba are obviously, it's kind of hard to find a lot of information about them, but generally I think they're over a shortage of medicine and food, as well as the general mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic, because I think a lot of countries in Latin America are feeling that vibe at the moment. And, you know, Cuba itself had provided a lot of medical aid and like medical staff to other countries during the pandemic. And I guess that favor's not been returned, and this anger about how much Cuba gives out to the world and how little it gets back. And, you know, there's this anger about US imperialism in Cuba and the lack of reforms that are always promised by the government and never given. And, you know, the majority of trade with Cuba is with the US itself, and this is just like the continued nature of it all. you know, Cuba will never be able to liberate itself without first liberating itself from the grasp of the US. But I think that's kind of something that needs to happen for the whole of Latin America. You know, that is still very much in the grips of the USA, and that's got to change. So, you know, I support the protests in Cuba. I mean, no matter what they're about, and, you know, I'm sure everyone has their opinions on it and how radical they are and how radical they're not and whatever. Any country that is so watched over by an imperialist power, specifically the US, you know, we have to support any ways of resistance. And, you know, we should try and guide discussions to a more sort of radical perspective in a more socialist ideal world. But, you know, we have to support that they're actually doing something. And, you know, Cuba's been doing like a lot for a long, long time. And, you know, while I don't think in these protests there is this kind of real united working class, which is really essential to create radical change, there is a real strength in numbers. And I think the fact that people are protesting means these discussions are being allowed. And, you know, respect is due to Cuba. You know, when you consider where Cuba started and then freeing itself from colonization and grappling with the US and imperialism, you know, it's quite a small place. It's definitely commendable. And, you know, I think as revolutionaries, we can draw a lot of inspiration and motivation from Cuba. And it gives us a lot of points to discuss and think about, you know, what could a socialist world look like and what do socialist ideals look like, and also the, you know, the importance of mass protests. But I think in order for Cuba to really be free, we need to see a banding together of the Cuban working class, you know, exercising a Marxist political strategy and staying true to it. But also there needs to be like a real strong international movement to support Cuba. No matter what's going on there, you know, we've got to support any resistance there. And, you know, as once upon a time, the colonizers said, you know, Cuba is the key to the new world. So if Cuba is the key to the new world, I say we take that key and use it. And we, and, you know, we build a new society, a new world built for workers and not bosses. Thank you. My, oh my, thanks everyone. That was a really amazing discussion. So many different things came up and so many questions, which I'm not probably going to be able to answer in the full capacity that you would like me to, but I will do my best. So I've just kind of like got loads of notes, so I apologize if this is a little bit all over the place, but I'll try and tie it together. So I think I'll start with talking about why the working class in Cuba has kind of failed and why they've not been able to seize power in the same way that sort of military and businessmen have. And I think there's so many reasons, but and it's very complex. I think one of them would be is that, you know, the working class in Cuba was originally slaves, and that's not a very good starting point to try and build like a movement, especially if you're already, you know, Cuba's a very small place, so you've got to compete with, you know, other people around you. And I think there must be a really big difference between like working class motivations and military motivations, and you're not going to try and be disagreeing with the guys with the guns. And because the military has been very like present in a lot of the struggles, I think it's really sort of limited the class's power to be able to take power for itself. And obviously these leaders are identified who are sort of like focusing on taking, you know, power for themselves. And, you know, US imperialism has had a massive effect on the country, and like the working class, as people said, you know, like the lack of food and the economy and everything, and, you know, the blockade and the fact that they've got like Guantanamo Bay there. It's all very like, I don't know, there's not a lot of support within the country itself for the working class. And I think it's been so long, like they must be very demoralized considering how many fightbacks they have been and how many like moments where they've been probably given hope by their leaders. And it's just kind of disappeared again. And to answer someone's question about would Cuba just be okay without US imperialism? I think the answer is probably no, because firstly, you know, the US is not the only imperialist power in the world with its eyes on Cuba. I'm sure there are plenty of others that would love to get their hands on it, and that would particularly piss the US off. So while the US still exists in its state, I think Cuba is always going to be an important piece. And if anybody else tries to interfere in Cuba, they're going to suffer the wrath of the United States. And nobody wants to be at the hands of that because it is brutal. And just generally in Cuba, I think there's sort of like this idea, especially with the protests at the moment, like people said, you know, it's like people are very much thinking this, if you're against the government, you're supporting, you know, the US, and kind of like these ideas are all very confusing. I feel like there's this idea that Cuba just kind of like had the revolution and were probably like one of the first places to do it, and obviously to do it so close to the US. There's almost like a lot of like subconscious pressure on them to behave in a particular way and to be a particular type of society and to sort of maintain a particular line, because, you know, a lot of the revolutionary ideals were good, and, you know, I'm sure there was an effort to stick to them in the beginning, but obviously that's not how society works. You know, we need to engage in dialectics, we need to be discussing and moving society forward and questioning things, and as someone said, they're not free to have this kind of like free thinking society, which makes me think, even though they have free education, how proficient is this education if they're not encouraging these kind of questions about society and about the state, like states in themselves. So yeah, I hope that kind of covers that a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about like is it Caroline who asked about religion in Cuba and stuff. I don't know specifically a lot about like how it affected Cuba, but I can give you kind of like, because my family's Colombian, so I can kind of like try and relate them, because they obviously were both colonized by the Spanish, so there's probably a lot of, you know, similarities. So in terms of religion, I think obviously colonization and by the Spanish, religion was a massive part of that, and the Catholic religion with the Spanish Inquisition, you know, people were basically killed if they didn't want to convert. And this really just kind of, I think it really just asserts a violent state nature from the off, but they're doing it under the guise of something that is meant to be like kind and loving, and you know, like it's always very confusing, you know, when people use religion for their own means, it becomes very brutal, but in its essence, I think religion is born out of more like working class struggles, and more kind of like faith itself is born out of like this kind of like collective mentality to want to believe in something better. And I think it affected Cuba in its revolution, probably because there's an element of people in society who are probably like, oh, God will sort it out. Like, you know, we'll just keep praying for the right, and, you know, it'll happen. They'll see sense, you know, the government are people they'll understand. And I think also, you know, Catholic ideals probably don't align very well with revolutionary strategies and ideals, you know, in the sense of, especially ones that are being led by the military in Cuba. I can't imagine they were very down with the violence of the situations and the guerrilla fighting and stuff. And in relation to that, you know, I think then we start to see this like a lot of sexism, because I think the Catholic religion at the time of, you know, the colonization, when it was first kind of established in Cuba, because they weren't Catholic before the Spanish came, is the oppression of women, and the kind of like, it's not necessarily like, I don't like particularly like there's loads of laws and stuff like that. It's more just kind of like, it's like that psychological oppression that you get when, you know, you're being forced to go to church every Sunday, and you're not hearing about women who have agency, and you're hearing about how you're subservient and all that kind of stuff. And I think that does progress in later years in Cuba as into sort of sexual violence, which is a strategy I'm sure is adopted from the US Army. And it's a very prolific thing in a lot of the coups, military coups that happen across Latin America, is the amount of sexual violence that happens and the amount of women that are kidnapped and you never see them again. So I think both those things had an element to play in all of Cuba's history, probably particularly within the revolution, because any revolution without women is not a revolution. You know, like you need women. We got a fire in us that, you know, you cannot be reckoned with. And then in relation to that, I guess talking about the LGBT rights in Cuba, again, I'm not particularly like versed on what it exactly is. It's quite hard to find stuff on Google that you can kind of believe to be accurate about Cuba. But I guess also, if you think about, you know, its religious roots and the Catholic roots, I can't imagine they're very okay with LGBT plus people. I know that there's been sort of like a recent kind of, they've been trying to like market themselves as a bit more LGBTQ friendly. I don't know how true that is. Obviously, it's not very true if they're arresting people. And I think this is like a common thing. You know, the people in Cuba are still oppressed for being LGBT, for being a woman, for being black probably, and like for being light skinned, whatever. Because always there's this like, we need to band together against the bigger evil that is the US. And I think now that's starting to split a little bit, is that people are like, but hold up, our government's not really doing us solid either. why should we only be focused on fighting the US when we should also, be fighting, on home turf? So that's quite an interesting development, and I guess we'll just have to see where it goes. In terms of the climate crisis in Cuba, I mean, it was quite funny. I was literally making notes about the climate crisis when someone asked the question. And I think this kind of relates to this idea of mass protest that is happening across the world. Time is kind of running out, and you have to face up to the climate crisis, even in this country. Like, people are feeling the effects of it, like, badly with the floods and everything like that. But here, like us, what is the weather? I don't know, but it was freezing last weekend, and it's August. It should be warm. So it's like, as the weather is polarizing, I think society is too, and this climate emergency has sort of put a ticking clock on where we're going to go now, because capitalism is not sustainable. There's not finite resources for it to just consume. Something has to shift. And I think for Cuba, this is, I guess, it's probably quite close to home, even if they don't realize it, that the climate movement should be a big part of supporting Cuba, because that is a country that from the off was like gutted for its natural resources, and it's things, and it's small as well. Like, unlike the rest of Latin America, there's a bit more space, so you can kind of ignore, it's like there's 3 cookies in the jar, you leave 1. It's like, well, I didn't take all the cookies. But Cuba is small, so it's hard to ignore that. And I think Cuba itself and Latin America, we can learn a lot from the indigenous people and how to work with the planet and how to like live among it in harmony. And the colonizing powers kind of took that away and made it so that we had to sort of completely transform nature all the time in order to make it work for us, even though nature did already kind of work for us. And this is, I think, part of like decolonizing our society, is talking how can we work with the planet itself. And just generally, imperialism is always quite bad for the environment, with war and boats and whatever. And I think something that kind of worries me particularly about the progression of climate change is Cuba gets a lot of its like income from tourism. And I kind of feel like we'll get to a point at some point, like, I don't know if people have seen that celebrities have been saying that they're not showering as often now to save the water, which is ridiculous. But if we get told to stop flying as often, and we have to staycation a bit more, what does that mean for Cuba? Because if they get so much of their income for that, and they're not able to sort of liberate themselves from US imperialism, like, they're pretty much screwed. So either like they're just going to have to keep fighting harder, or they're just going to have to like lay down. And that's why I think it is so important that we really do build like a solidarity move, like international solidarity movement with Cuba and with Latin America as a whole, because I think quite often it can be forgotten about in a lot of, when we talk about the struggles of different countries and we talk about colonization. We get very much focused on, sort of the Middle East and Africa and, what's going on there. But what, Latin America needs reparations too. If they didn't, the native people there were the first slaves, and then they killed them all, so they had to go and get more. And, there's such a strength in numbers, and being able to sort of understand the relationships between our society and Cuban society, in the fact that our governments are just being a bit shit, and maybe we want to do something a bit better, and the workers probably know what's up a bit more. We're really going to just band together, ye are many, they are few. That's why I think if you're not a member of the SWP, I think you should join, because like I said in my talk, a lot of the Cuban revolutions are focused on a particular set of leaders, but within the SWP, everybody learns how to become a leader and learns how to sort of build that united front and go into other movements and become that leader. And it's just a really, really great place to sort of explore international solidarity and to really, really build it. So yeah, that's kind of it from me. I'll just say we need a revolution. We're running out of time, and it's been a really, really great meeting. Thanks, guys.